Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this Grattan Institute briefing. I'm Jordana Hunter, the Director of the Education Program at the Grattan Institute, and I'm joined by my colleague Nick Parkinson, who's the co-author of the report that we're here to talk to you about today, The Maths Guarantee, How to Boost Students' Learning in Primary School. We come to you today from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We acknowledge and celebrate First Nations people here and right across this country, and acknowledge the traditional lands on which we meet and work, and the cultures are amongst the oldest in human history. So hopefully all of us in the audience today know the Grattan Institute is an independent, not-for-profit think tank. We are not politically aligned. We make recommendations to government primarily, and we try to base our work on the most rigorous evidence we can get our hands on, and we try to be as rigorous as possible in our analysis. I'd particularly like to thank the generous support of the Origin Energy Foundation for this project that we're talking to you about today. So the report, which we published on Monday, sets out how we think Australia can best address our maths problem and give all children the best chance of success. So we want Australia to end its degree of comfort, I think, with maths mediocrity. We're incredibly excited about the incredible work that's happening right across the country in so many schools, with so many primary school teachers just delivering great practice day in, day out, and really shifting the odds for students. But we want that practice to be common practice right across the country, and we do think governments need to step up to make that happen. Over the next 40 minutes or so, Nick Parkinson and I will talk you through the report. We're really grateful for all the questions that have been sent through in advance, and we'll try to answer some of those as we go along and at the end of the session. There's also a comments feature in the webinar, so feel free to add any comments and we can try to come to those as well. Thanks, Nick. So why do we write a report about mathematics? We do think maths is probably the poor cousin of reading, particularly in primary schools, and we wanted to help address that lack of prioritisation that we've seen maths receive. This is a big project. We've been working on it for at least 18 months now, and we'll be publishing 2 reports. The first is a report that came out on Monday. It's a report primarily designed for politicians, policymakers inside government departments and different agencies, leaders in the Catholic and independent sector, and anyone really who's interested in school education and public policy, which is most people in Australia. We're also hoping that lots of teachers and school leaders will pick it up and engage with it as well. We will be publishing a report that's directly for and written for school leaders and teachers in schools, and that will come out in June. Now, Grattan, we're often biting off almost more than we can chew, and this is probably the biggest, most ambitious research report we've done to date. We did a new survey of 1,745 teachers and school leaders for this report. We did a detailed literature review. We wanted to make sure our recommendations picked up the best available evidence to date on how to teach maths in primary school. 7 case studies, which I'll talk about in a second. We also had a look at some international case studies. So, Australia doesn't need to reinvent the wheel in everything on its own. So we did have a close look at Singapore and England, 2 jurisdictions that have invested very heavily in teaching expertise in primary mathematics. Thanks, Nick. So I just want to touch on those case studies. Incredibly privileged to spend some time in 7 exceptional primary schools across the country. We wanted to make sure that we visited schools in different states, different sectors, working in different levels of community advantage and disadvantage, and at different stages of their journey implementing best practice approaches to teaching mathematics. Now, we selected these cases not as a random sample. They were selected because they were all committed to putting the research base of best practice maths teaching into practice. We know that is often tricky organisational work, and we wanted to understand how the schools were doing that work. So how they were coordinating the work of teachers, how they were investing in professional development and bringing that evidence base to light. So just to quickly shout out who we visited, we had Wattle Grove Primary School just outside Perth, a public school, Ballarat Clarendon College, an independent school in regional Victoria, Bentley West Primary School, a really standout government primary school in Melbourne, St Bernard's Primary School, which is part of the Canberra-Goulburn Catholic school system, the Entrance Budgerwoy, and Charleston South Primary School, which are 3 primary schools part of the explicit and systematic teaching network in New South Wales. And across those 7 schools, a really great mix of schools in that group. Thanks, Nick. So why are we here today? We have, unfortunately, a maths problem in Australia. If we have a look at the NAPLAN data, what we can see is that around 1 in 3 children are not meeting the NAPLAN proficient benchmark across year 3, 5, 7, and 9. Now, this is the headline statistic for the whole country. It's based on those students who are in the needs additional support and developing categories of that NAPLAN proficiency scale. Now, what does proficiency mean? It's a cut point based on a reasonable expectation of what children should have learnt the year prior to sitting the NAPLAN test. It's not a particularly high bar. You can reach that proficient benchmark in year 9 if you are working at the average year 7 level. So it's not a particularly high bar, but it is a reasonable indication that you have mastered the content you need in order to make the most of the teaching as it becomes increasingly more complicated. Now, just to quickly call out, that national average of 1 in 3 obviously does vary across jurisdictions, but even in Victoria and ACT, our highest performing jurisdictions, there's between about a quarter and 30% of students who are not proficient. And obviously, the Northern Territory has a much higher level, getting close to 60% of students who are not proficient. Thanks, Nick. Now, obviously, there's some significant distributional issues as well, masked by that headline data. Unfortunately, it's children who tend to come from more disadvantaged backgrounds, who tend to be less likely to be proficient in NAPLAN. We're seeing, some real challenges for our First Nations children, and also from children who are from families with more educational and socioeconomic disadvantage, as well as children that live in regional areas. I think it's interesting here to call out that children from non-English speaking backgrounds actually tend to perform better overall. There might be something about that cohort, more of an immigrant background being a little bit more educationally aspirational on average. We're also seeing girls are lagging behind boys in Australia. I should note, though, this is a relative challenge in Australia. Girls in Singapore significantly outperform Australian boys. So, we can definitely get our girls closer to our boys, and we want to be shifting Australian girls and Australian boys to be performing more strongly right across that spectrum there. Now, just to note, if you're falling behind, if a child is falling behind in mathematics, that can have really significant implications for them and set off, quite a negative spiral, I guess. So, we know that children that are struggling with reading and also with mathematics are more likely to become disengaged with school, have lower kind of self-esteem issues, and find learning across the spectrum more challenging. So it really is important that we tackle this problem. Thanks, Nick. Some of you might have seen some of the commentary around Australia's international performance in mathematics. It is concerning. We're well off the pace of countries in the East Asian and Southeast Asian region. You can see here Singapore in the 2023 Trends in International Maths and Science study. They had 49% of children reaching that advanced level in TIMSS. But it's also a challenge for Australia to catch up with some of our traditional peers like England. They have 22% of their year 4s reaching that advanced category. In Australia, it was 13%. And I just want to call out as well, that does mask some pretty significant variation across the country. Tasmania only had 5% of their year 4 students reaching that advanced category. ACT only had 11%. So there's clearly some work to do. Thanks, Nick. Now, I'm just very quickly going to say why are we starting in primary school? There's clearly challenges in secondary as well. Just want to call out a few kind of key pointers here. Maths is highly cumulative, so strong foundations really, really matter. We need to make sure our children are where they are confident with mathematics, have the foundations in place before they hit secondary school. We also know children tend to be more engaged in education in primary. Their attendance levels are higher. Little people love learning. They love their teachers. Even if they come from quite challenging kind of community context, family context, they tend to love going to school. So there's a real opportunity there. I've mentioned these achievement gaps can become quite difficult to shift once children hit secondary school, which is another reason to start in primary. And the last one I just want to call out is that based on a really significant number of school visits and time traveling around the country, we think there are really significant opportunities to shift the needle in primary schools. So, as I said, maths is the poor cousin of reading. As Eddie Wu has said, primary teachers are the pentathletes of teaching. They're generalists. They're expected to be a master of many different content domains. And I think it's fair to say we've just underinvested in the level of support in primary teaching. So we're really optimistic that we can get some big shift here if we give maths the love it deserves. Speaking of which, I'm going to throw to Nick Parkinson now, and he's going to talk through what the research base says about effective teaching in primary schools. Thanks, Nick.
Thank you so much, Jordana. And I'm really excited to be with you all today and share some of what we learned through this project. We did a quite extensive literature review, so we're going to touch on some of the highlights from that. But as always, there's more information in the report itself. To begin, I think it's worthwhile remembering that math teachers are in the business of memory. We want students to remember what we teach them. And so it's helpful to just set up this section with a bit of a primer on memory. So in most simple terms, memory consists of really two parts. We've got our working memory, and that's where the brain processes information in a maths problem. But working memory has significant limitations. Researchers suggest it can hold between about 2 to 5 pieces of information at once, but for less than 30 seconds without reinforcement. And these constraints make it the bottleneck of thinking when doing maths problems. Luckily, we've got long-term memory, and that's a workaround. It has virtually unlimited capacity. And what this means is that when students have maths knowledge stored in their long-term memory, it reduces the demands of a maths problem for them to solve in working memory. This means they're less likely to experience what's called cognitive overload, which is where the total mental demands of a maths problem exceed the capacity available in working memory. Now, this is a helpful kind of background understanding, but actually to put this into practice in the classroom, we kind of need to look elsewhere. And so somewhere we've looked for this report is the instructional hierarchy. The instructional hierarchy is a concept that puts this brain research into practice, and it is really helpful in thinking about the kind of teaching approaches that students need at different points of that continuum, from being a novice with a particular skill or piece of knowledge in maths, all the way through to being a master with that bit of maths. It consists of 4 elements, and I'm going to talk about each of these in turn. So let's begin with acquisition. When students are learning new material, that is, when they're acquiring it, they need explicit teaching. So by explicit teaching, I mean that the teacher is explaining new material upfront, they're modeling it step by step, they're giving students plenty of guided practice, and that's practice where the whole class is working on a problem at once, with the teacher stepping students through the steps and providing feedback at each point. This type of teaching differs from an approach in which students, when learning new material, might be expected to try solve a problem before being shown how to do it, from approaches where students are expected to deduce strategies on their own, and approaches where teacher explanations are retrospective, that is, they come at the end of an activity or task. Effective explicit teaching is really dynamic and fast-paced. So for this project, in the case study schools we visited, there were constant student responses. Teachers were posing loads of questions, checking that students understood all throughout. One tool that they used to great effect was a mini whiteboard. So a mini whiteboard is a small whiteboard that students use to solve a maths problem and hold up to their chests. This allows teachers to scan the room and see how many students have got it. They can identify any misconceptions that may have cropped up and dispel them. And they also have a sense of whether the class is getting it and are ready to move on, or whether they might need another question or another explanation. Now, once students are accurate with a particular part of maths, they then need opportunities to build fluency. So fluency is that mixture of speed and accuracy. Particularly important in fluency is committing certain mathematical knowledge to memory. And I'll explain why this is in just a moment. Now, fluency requires a lot of practice, but we shouldn't dismiss that practice out of hand as drilling. Mastering most hard things takes a lot of practice. Just ask any budding musician. Now, some of that practice should be timed. And the reason for this is that once students are highly accurate in a skill, so they're nearly always getting 100% correct, teachers need more data. And in particular, rate-based data, that's the number of digits correct per minute, for example, to to know whether or not students have actually mastered that skill and habit firmly and easily retrievable from long-term memory. You might have heard a little bit about something called maths facts. In the last 2 days, there's been a bit of discussion around timetables. So maths facts are things like 6 plus 7 equals 13. What we know from the research is it's super clear that automatic recall of maths facts really helps students succeed in maths. Automatic means that students can recall those maths facts to mind without hesitation. So that's typically under 2 to 3 seconds. I do want to emphasize this is just one part of maths. It's a very important part because it's a gateway skill to what comes after, but it needn't take up a lot of the actual time of a maths block within a school. So when we're thinking about maths facts, the research suggests that even 4 minutes of practice per day can see gains. It can also be really fun. So students can race against the clock. They can compete at flashcard games with a partner, or they can even use digital applications that gamify fluency practice. It's also important to understand why this matters so much. So what I want to do is walk everyone through an example. I'm wearing my maths shirt today, so we're going to do some maths. And that example will make it clear just how important these skills are for students' development in maths. What we've got here is a question from about the Year 5 curriculum. We've got 6,725 multiplied by 78. We're going to do the first part of this problem using the column multiplication method. If that sounds new to you as we begin, I think you'll remember it from your time in school. So the first thing we do is we multiply 8 by 5, and that's going to give us 40. I'm going to rename 40 as 4 tens and 0 ones. The next step is then to multiply 8 and 2 tens, and that'll give me 16 tens. I'll add the 4 tens from before, and that will give me 20 tens, which I'll rename as 2 hundreds and 0 tens. I'm then going to multiply 8 and the 700s. That'll give me 56 hundreds. And I'll add on the 200s from before to get 5800s, which I'll name as 5,800. I'm then going to multiply the 8 and the 6,000s. That'll give me 48,000s. And I'm going to add the 5,000s on from before, and that will give me 53,000. Now, this is just the first step. Students then also need to multiply 70 by 6,725. They then need to sum together the partial products. What you will have noticed is there was a lot of maths that was quite rapid there and that I wasn't counting on my fingers. Now, this problem in total involves 8 multiplication facts and 11 addition facts, so 19 simple calculations in total. It's a problem that's much easier for students who've committed maths facts to memory to do. So let's actually just imagine some students. We begin with Kylie. So Kylie is not fluent in her maths facts. She doesn't have them committed to memory. So she might need to rely on strategies like for a 7 times tables counting or skip counting. So 7, 14, 21. For her 8 times tables, she might need to double again and double once more. So to get 8 times 3, she'd go 3 doubled is 6, 6 doubled is 12, and then doubled once more gives you 24. Now, these strategies have a place, but they're no kind of substitute for the automatic recall that students will eventually need for more complex maths. Kylie might make mistakes as she's going and get overwhelmed. And if she takes 10 seconds to do each of those 19 simple calculations, this question would take her 3 minutes. In contrast, Fatima knows all of her 7 and 8 times tables by heart. She can recall each one within 2 seconds. She does the question in just over half a minute. And in the time Kylie's working on the question, Fatima can do more practice, getting better and better. Now, this may seem like a kind of straightforward question, but we can also think about it in the context of more complex questions. So let's imagine instead of 78, we're multiplying by $7.80, and we have a question like this. Ibrahim gets $7.80 of pocket money each week. Will he be able to buy a $429 Nintendo Switch console after saving for 1 year? If so, how much money will he have left over? And if not, how much more money would he need to save? You can see that having maths facts makes a question like this more simple, having them stored securely lodged in long-term memory. So that's why fluency matters, but fluency particularly matters so that we can get students to this stage that we're all working towards, which is generalization. And it's generalization that's really often the goal of maths teaching. This is when students adapt what they know and apply it to unfamiliar contexts. What's been a challenge sometimes is that we've confused the ends with the mean, and we wanted to start here before students are necessarily ready for it. This is really well-intentioned, but it risks overloading students' working memory. And this can thwart their efforts at doing the tasks can create frustration, and it can fuel feelings of being bad at maths. It can also create equity issues. So sometimes generalization tasks, you'll see them and they look like a bit of group work, but students who might have that knowledge already, because maybe they've been tutored, might do the lion's share of the work, while their peers who don't have that knowledge kind of sit back, disengage, maybe start having those disruptive behaviors, and they don't take as much learning from the lesson. What good generalization looks like is giving problems to students where they have to kind of figure out and discriminate which skill to use to solve that problem. So that might be a worded problem where it's not immediately obvious whether to use addition or subtraction. Also at the generalization stage, students benefit from problems with multiple possible solutions or problems that require them to kind of synthesize different math skills. Importantly, the kind of tasks that are set at this stage should be carefully planned so the focus is on the maths. What isn't helpful is tasks which involve lots of extraneous elements, like lots of cutting and pasting, that maybe detract from the underlying maths. I think it's helpful to talk about an example here. So the example that I'm about to talk about is for a year 3 group of students. It's part of a 4-lesson sequence, and one that we found online. Now, the aim of this lesson is for students to build an understanding of fractions, and in particular, to consolidate their knowledge of unit fractions. So those are fractions where the numerator is a 1, something like a half, a third, 1/8. In this lesson, students explore the optimal fraction to fill a bottle up with water so that it lands upright when flipped. And this draws on several bits of knowledge. Students need to be able to accurately measure, including converting milliliters to liters and vice versa. They need to record and interpret data, including tallying. They need to calculate volume, including in tapered bottles where volume is not uniform, like those ones that are on the slide. And they need to be able to simplify fractions. So there's quite a lot of skills that would go into kind of solving the maths needed to solving this problem using the underlying math skills. Now, this could be a fun end-of-term activity. It gets students outside. There's a bit of competition involved. There's a real risk that students finish the lesson. They've had a lot of fun competing at bottle flip, but they haven't really attended to the underlying maths. It's no substitute for the practice students need with important gateway skills that come throughout the later stages of the primary curriculum, such as simplifying fractions, identifying equivalent fractions, or ordering fractions by their magnitude. Another problem with a task like this is that teachers can't control the outcome. So let's imagine a student brings in a 650 ml bottle of water, and it lands upright most when it's filled with 200 mils. For a year 3 student to try and simplify that is pretty hard. It gives you 4/13 as a fraction. Now, that's one we could simplify. There are other possible outcomes which would be much harder to simplify. Students may not have seen 13ths in year 3, and so these students might be stuck. In short, it's important that when we're giving activities during the generalization phase, we're thinking carefully about what are students going to take from those activities. Are they focusing enough on the maths that we want them to learn and apply? The final stage of the instructional hierarchy is maintenance. And the key point of maintenance is that students will forget information unless they review it. And so what's really important is that schools have what's called spaced or distributed retrieval practice. This involves spacing out when students will revisit knowledge, and it involves asking them questions that make them kind of apply some effort to recalling information to mind that they've previously learned. This is often done through 10-minute lesson warm-ups or frequent cumulative reviews. But what's most important is this can't be done by a teacher working alone. Spacing out exactly when to revisit the maths and also knowing the appropriate sequence in which to teach maths is a lot of work for a single teacher. And from a student's perspective, they have 7 years of primary school, so they need to be retrieving across those 7 years. This is why a whole school approach is the only way to make the instructional hierarchy work in practice. So what we did is a big survey to see how common a whole school approach is. And what we found is it's not the norm. Fewer than half of teachers said that maths is in their timetable. We know students need a lot of practice with maths. And even if you were a student in a school with an hour of maths per day, you never fell sick, you never had a camp. In this hypothetical world, you just have 200 hours of maths per year. That's not a whole lot to learn all the things we want students to learn by the end of grade 6. So when maths isn't on the timetable, there's a much greater risk that students don't get the maths learning they're entitled to. Maths might be the first thing to drop when interruptions inevitably arise, so like that assembly. The other thing that we found was that fewer than half of teachers say there's consensus at their school on what effective teaching entails. Now, this is unsurprising. We've left teachers in a really difficult situation, giving them a confusing hodgepodge of messages. And without agreement, it's unsurprising that many schools don't have a roadmap for what teachers are going to learn in each term of school. What students, sorry, are going to learn in each term of school. This isn't fair on teachers, and it's not fair on students either. As for teachers, it means that they might have been abandoned to figure out what to teach in each term of school. They have to do the planning on their own for the class. And if they haven't necessarily taught a year level before, knowing the optimal sequence and how long to spend on different points of the curriculum is quite a lot of work. For students, there's a real risk that they experience kind of a disjointed curriculum year on year, and that they maybe progress through school with significant gaps in their maths. When we look at the next level of planning, so documented lesson plans and also agreed textbooks or lesson level materials, there are many teachers working in schools where these aren't the norm. This is despite clear research saying that these are really helpful both to teachers in terms of building their self-efficacy and their confidence in class, as well as kind of reducing some of that planning workload, as well as for students. We were also interested through this project in understanding a bit more about how confident primary teachers feel doing maths. As Jordana mentioned before, we ask so much of primary teachers. They are, as Eddie Wu says, the pentathletes of teachers. We wanted to better understand, therefore, their attitudes to maths to just start a conversation. So we asked current primary teachers who are teaching maths, so not art teachers or specialist language teachers, how they felt. Most enjoyed teaching maths, and that's great news, but there is a cohort who do feel nervous about it. 21% said they worried more about teaching maths than other subjects. We also asked school leaders their views on whether or not teachers at their school who are currently teaching a maths class would feel confident to teach year 5s and 6. And the vast majority of school leaders, 94%, said at least some teachers would be hesitant to teach upper primary. This can make timetabling really challenging. I want to be crystal clear at this point. This is not about blaming teachers. We've not armed them with adequate support, and we've done a huge disservice by underestimating just how complex it is to teach primary maths well. How can we, for example, expect primary teachers to feel confident when 47% said that they didn't receive feedback on their maths teaching in the past year? The other thing we know from the case study research is that all primary teachers have that capability to be really great maths teachers with enough support. In the case study schools, we met teachers who once upon a time felt nervous about teaching maths, but now, having adopted a more systematic approach, love teaching it. I'm going to pass to Jordana now, who's going to talk about how to kind of spread that feeling and some of the reforms we're recommending to boost maths and help more teachers experience that thing we saw in case study schools of teachers experiencing the sugar hit of their students making more progress. Thanks, Jordana.
Thanks, Nick. Well, that was great. I loved watching you do some maths live in the webinar. So really, really appreciate your commitment to the cause there. As Nick said, the research base on best practice teaching is really strong, and it has been great to see a number of states and territories and Catholic dioceses in particular, put their hand up and commit to realigning their approaches in line with that evidence base. I think the challenge is still one of implementation. And so with our research report here, the report that's really focusing in on policymakers, we've tried to really target the implementation dimensions of the challenge through a maths guarantee strategy, which is a 10-year strategy to get Australia back on track. So, we have over 200,000 primary school teachers in Australia, over 7,500 primary schools. Spreading practice is the name of the game. We've got great primary schools already, some great primary school teachers already, but getting that consistently into every classroom is what we need to be pushing for. Thanks, Nick. So obviously there's a lot more detail in our report, and I'm just going to touch on some of the headline issues here so we've got some time for questions. But the first thing is, really we're calling on governments to raise their level of ambition, set, much higher aspirations, stop accepting maths mediocrity in Australia, and really start with stronger foundations in primary school. So we have called for a long-term goal of 90% of Australian children reaching that NAPLAN proficient benchmark. That is a stretch goal. It will take some time, particularly in some of our jurisdictions that are starting further behind, to get there. It's not going to happen overnight, and it probably won't happen in our 10-year strategy, but we think if we really commit, In the next 10 years, we could get Australia from about 65% to about 80% NAPLAN proficiency, which would put us well on that path. Now, NAPLAN isn't perfect, but it is a good indicator, and it's a national indicator that we have. So setting that proficiency benchmark tied to NAPLAN, we think is the right place to start. Thanks, Nick. Now, Nick's mentioned that teachers have received a hodgepodge of mixed messages. It's not hard to find mixed messages out there when you look for maths guidance on the internet from government departments. There really is a need to step up and invest in really strong, clear, practical guidance for teachers on what the best practice evidence base says and how they can put that into practice in their schools. So, we need to get beyond just providing vague advice to teachers like track your students' progress or adapt your teaching based on data. Get much more specific about what assessments, for example, teachers should actually be using. Now, the guidance shouldn't be mandatory. We're not recommending mandatory guidance, but it should be there for, harried, busy principals and teachers who really, the reality of life in a lot of schools is a lot of firefighting. If we're really going to give the profession the respect it deserves, making sure they've got good advice that they can turn to and rely on, we think is really critical. The other part of this is actually the de-implementation of poor or bad advice. There's still a bit of bad advice out there on websites that does need to be de-implemented. And I think departments have got some work to do to get everyone inside government departments sort of aligned around best practice to make sure they're not making the mixed messaging to schools even worse. Thanks, Nick. Now, we do need to make sure that teachers have got the right tools of the trade. We wouldn't send a carpenter onto a building site without a hammer or a saw. We wouldn't send a surgeon into an operating theatre without gloves and a scalpel. You wouldn't send an accountant into the office without a calculator. And yet we routinely send teachers into the classroom without robust tools of the trade, curriculum materials and assessments, and expect them to produce those themselves. Now, we know even if we halved class sizes, doubled release time, the vast majority of teachers would not have enough hours in the day to produce really high quality curriculum materials. Some schools have gotten there themselves. They've been able to pull it together, and they report they did so with a lot of extra overtime from teachers. Now, that's not always possible, and primary schools don't always have the mathematical expertise in-house to produce those really high quality materials. So there are things available externally. We need to give better advice to teachers about what is genuinely high quality and what we could recommend they could adopt and adapt to their context. And the same goes with assessments. So, making sure we're doing the research necessary to have really strong validated assessments, particularly screening tools in Australia. It's a real gap. And also providing better advice on intervention programs. Thanks, Nick. Now, my favourite category is around building expertise, professional expertise. This is my core research interest. There's a lot we can do in this space, and I'm super excited about it. Obviously, there are some reforms happening for initial teacher education. We need to stay the course on that. But we also need to think about better equipping the teachers in the workforce already. And we've looked to England and Singapore and drawn on this concept of strong micro credentials as a way of really building professional expertise. So at Grattan, we're recommending 3 new micro credentials, one for primary teachers, effectively on the mathematical content that they can pick and choose from a series of modules to brush up their skills. It might be on things like working with fractions or developing conceptual understanding and application problems, or doing that student error analysis that we know is critical. A micro-credential for leading mathematics in schools. So that's really about setting up that whole school approach, possibly for assistant principals or instructional leaders. And then a micro-credential that's really focused in on supporting catching up those students that fall behind, or extension for our high achievers. These would all be about 1 to 2 years in length, and we're recommending that they're structured so that teachers can complete them during their full-time work with just 1 to 2 hours of work each week to get them done, and incentivising teachers, recognising their discretionary effort through a big scholarship pool. So if anyone from the Commonwealth is listening, we'd love the Commonwealth Government to set up a $10 million per annum scholarship pool to really support teachers and schools to sign up for these voluntary micro-credentials. We're also recommending establishing maths hubs across the country. Again, this is something that's been tried in England and it's been very successful. As I said, there's some tremendous primary schools already doing great work. And what we'd like to see is more recognition of that exceptional work that's already happening in the country and supporting those exceptional teachers to work shoulder to shoulder with their peers. So we'd like to see 50 maths hubs set up across the country, staffed with expert primary maths coaches who are working shoulder to shoulder with the primary schools in their region. And we think that if we dose this right, we could actually support all primary schools in Australia to get that great practice in place within the 10-year maths guarantee strategy. Might just quickly move to the last one here, Nick, and as I said, lots more detail in our report. We do think we need a stronger screener in the early years. Grade 3 NAPLAN is a little bit too long to wait to know if children are on track with their learning or not. We need to make sure that that screener that's used in the early years is fit for purpose and is quick to administer. So there's some more research that needs to happen to get that done, but it's good to hear some positive signs across the country that there's an appetite for getting something in place. The last one here is about strengthening school and principal reviews. Review processes are happening across the country, but they differ significantly in how closely they look at the instructional core. So we are calling for school reviews to take a closer look at the instructional core in mathematics, including the curriculum materials that are in use and how well that's actually picked up in the classroom, so that there's an opportunity for more professional feedback and support for schools that need that to get really strong practice happening. Thanks, Nick. Now, our strategy is, we think it's the right strategy. It's also a cost-effective strategy. At full scale, we estimate it would cost around $152 million per year nationally. That's the national headline figure. That's less than 0.4% of current government spending on primary schools. So, we think it's highly affordable within the current budget envelope. It works out to be about $67 per primary school student on average. Now, there will be some more money coming down the pipe through the new Better and Fairer Schools agreement. But while that's getting ramped up, we don't think there's any budgetary reason not to invest in primary school mathematics. In fact, we think it's the least we can do for Australian children. Now, that's brought us to the end of the formal part of the presentation. I know there's been some great questions actually that have come in the chat function. There's also a lot of questions that came in before the session today. Hopefully we've answered some of them through the presentation itself, but I would like to throw a couple to Nick, and if we've got time, he might throw a couple to me. Nick, I'm going to kick off and just ask you, how can adopting a single teaching style effectively address the diverse skills and knowledge of our students? What does an inclusive approach look like in maths? This is a great question.
I'm hoping I'm off mute now. Sorry, I just missed that. This is, a question that we got quite a bit, Jordana, from different people in the lead up to this webinar. And I think in maths education, we've sometimes thought about inclusion in various different ways. So in our case study schools, what they used to do is they had small breakout workstations where students would rotate doing different activities, or sometimes they had different activities pitched at different levels. They told us this required quite a bit of planning and setup. And when you think about the practicalities of a classroom running multiple concurrent lessons, what you kind of get is teachers whose time is quite divided. Sometimes it can be a little bit chaotic too. This is different from a whole of class teaching approach that allows teachers to get data on how all of their students are going. What we heard from the case study schools is that in shifting to this kind of more explicit teaching during that acquisition phase, students who had learning difficulties actually found the maths classrooms more inclusive. So when there were those concurrent workstations, students who might have had difficulties such as ADHD found it a little bit hard to follow. But now with the structured routines and whole class participation, they're feeling like they're making better progress. What I would say is that with this type of teaching, you can still be incredibly responsive. That whole class participation allows teachers to do things such as hold some students and work with some students in guided practice for a little bit longer, doing some more questions with them while other students go ahead with the independent application on their own with slightly less scaffolding. It also means that in our case study schools, they often use things like early finisher work for students who maybe work through content a bit quicker. And another concern that we've heard a bit, Jordana, is about what does this look like for high performers? We visited some really high performing schools with students who were working well ahead of kind of what you might expect for their age. And they were doing some tricky generalization problems. What they found is that those high performers benefit from this way of teaching too. It gives them extra mastery of knowledge that they may be familiar with. But also because students who previously struggled were now actually on track, the teachers were able to pitch their classes at a higher level and also go at a faster pace.
That's great, Nick. Can I ask a bonus question there? It's one that came up in the chat. There was some questions about, children that might suffer from maths anxiety, and particularly with the timed practice. Do you want to add anything to that before we move on?
Yeah, I'll just really quickly, we looked at some of the research on maths anxiety, and what the research tends to suggest is that it has a really strong connection with students' success in maths, and that actually sometimes it can be a bit of a learnt fear. So if students experience success, they're less likely to feel anxious about maths. Now, one of the kind of key areas where we can do this is with those foundational facts. All students can learn those relatively quickly, almost all students. And what the research suggests is that if you're timing students in stuff they already know, that's unlikely to provoke more kind of anxiety. It's really about not making sure you're not giving students kind of time tests for stuff that you've not taught them before.
Yeah, great. Now, another quick one. We're going to do kind of rapid fire here because we've only got a few more minutes. Nick, a lot of people have asked us about the Australian curriculum. Is it something that, we can't do this work in schools until we fix the Australian curriculum? What do you think about that?
I think the short answer is no. The new Australian curriculum is better than the last one. Look, we can always be more rigorous, but for the moment, the Australian curriculum isn't a barrier to high quality teaching. It's a hard lever to reform. It takes a while to negotiate and sign off. So there's a lot schools can do right now.
Yeah.
I might throw one back at you, Jordana, which is just that we've heard a little bit, you sometimes hear that, well, kind of prescribing a certain way of teaching maths might undermine professional autonomy. What's kind of your response to that?
Yeah, look, this is a really interesting question, and absolutely, the goal here is to build the profession, build a really strong expert profession right across the country, so that it's teachers in the classroom leading best practice approaches and also generating and innovating in this area going forward. So, if we think about how other professions are set up, there tends to be, I would say, a more significant investment in building really rigorous professional knowledge around the research base in that profession, be it, psychology, accounting, medical work, social work, for example. And then once kind of the baby professionals are sort of mastered that work, they start to do some of that innovative frontier work themselves. So I'd really like to see, a bit more of that actually happening in the teaching profession, really building that strong understanding of the research base so that teachers are really set up to thrive in the classroom and then contribute back into that research base. So, this is not about deprofessionalizing teachers at all. In fact, teachers need to be equipped with, all the research sort of and the best practice approaches, not just so they could deliver that in the classroom, but they know when to deviate from that as well, because they're there at the front line. They're the ones that know their children best. And we need to kind of just do more to set them up for success, I think.
We've only got a minute left, Jordana, but I think maybe just one final question, which is kind of what's the message you want to leave people with? How hopefully are you feeling after doing this research?
I feel incredibly optimistic. Like the best part of our jobs, I think, and speaking for you, Nick, certainly speaking for myself, is getting out into schools and working with teachers and seeing little people have so much fun doing maths across these case study schools. I mean, absolutely the highlight of my year last year. And, seeing teachers reflect on how, as you said, like perhaps they were previously nervous teaching maths and now they love it and it's their favorite subject to teach. So I just think we can get this done, right? Like I think with the right level of energy and support and a commitment to stay the course, we can really lift outcomes and just, have our young people thriving and also support our teachers to feel like absolute superstars every single day. So I'm super excited, and I want to thank everyone for joining us for this session today. It was really nice to be able to go into the detail. If you want more, there's 111 pages in the main policy report and a principal guide to come out in June. Lots of questions we couldn't get to. Maybe we'll try and answer as many as we can on social media, but also please reach out and get in touch with us. We will be posting this webinar on social media shortly, so please feel free to share it with everyone. Thanks again to the Origin Energy Foundation who supported this research. We really appreciate that support. This is hard work that we're all in the trenches doing together, and we're in awe of all the teachers who are, turning up every day and just, changing lives. So thanks, everyone. I hope you have a great afternoon. Bye.